No, it was a flip chart. No, not with flip chart.
Okay.
I want to use some balls. I want to show some.
Oh, you want like a giant toaster, like a giant board, like a page that you flip.
Right. Well, anything. I want to show the audience. Right.
She wants like a big piece of paper that she can draw on to show the audience.
These, I mean, it's so clever.
Or maybe what about art?
This is Thank you very much.
From our point
of view, yeah, that's right.
I guess when you do start drawing stuff, I'll get in the audience and I can say what you're doing.
What if I get that? Otherwise I'll do it with words, but it's much harder.
Several hundred miles from every day in Texas. It's very good for a grad student because rent is very cheap.
Oh, that's not what it is. Right, so it's not, it's Boston, is the,
So,
even near.
So if this is Texas,
Yes.
I think everything else big is like around. So if you think about this distance here, this is, imagine this is the country of France. Go, I'm on the other.
Okay, the other end. Huh? It's Texas Tech University in Lubbock.
Lubbock, L-U-B-B-O-C-K. I will say the Free Market Institute is trying to keep a little brother of the Hayek said. So I guess if anyone wants someplace nice in the United States to go, the Free Market Institute, I think is probably happy to have guest speakers. They're obviously not in charge of that, but have the powers that be there. I'm sure would be happy to hear from people. There you go.
A nice big
Please, we may start now the second session. And for this session, we will listen Michael Makovi, who is a PhD student at Texas Tech in Lubbock, Texas. And his paper is entitled The Freedom of the Prices, Hayek and Jewkes on Egalitarianism and Freedom of Occupation. Please, Michael.
Thank you. First I'll say thank you for having me here at the Instituto Bruno Leoni. It's exciting to know that there are classical liberal groups in other countries. And this is my first time in Italy, so it's very exciting. I'll just briefly say where I'm associated, the Free Market Institute is a very new organization at Texas Tech University. So if anyone is looking for anything exciting in the United States, I'm sure you all know, for example, about the Cato Institute, please look up the Free Market Institute. We're very new. It's my first year with them too. So I will first say is my paper is motivated by some previous papers I wrote. That I wrote about George Orwell, as I interpreted him as a public choice economist. I wanted to understand how a socialist like Orwell could write books like Animal Farm in 1984. And then I compared him to Eugen Richter and Henry Hazlitt, who both wrote novels using the Austrian problem of economic calculation to explain socialism. So I've been looking a lot at how the Austrian arguments and the public choice arguments about socialism are quite different. The Austrian argument arguing about the limits of human knowledge and could the powers that be know what needs to be done. Public choice saying, let's assume the government knows what needs to be done. What incentives will they actually have to do those things? So it's two, I think they're both arguments are true, but they're both different arguments, knowledge versus incentives. So I'm going to talk about how Hayek talks about knowledge rather than incentives, and what this has to do with labor prices and freedom of occupation. So Milton Friedman is famous for saying that the advocacy of democratic socialism rests on the belief that politics and economics are separate and largely unconnected, and that any kind of political arrangements can be combined with any kind of economic arrangements. So Friedman said, no, that's not true. You can't disconnect politics and economics, that the one presupposes the other, and his famous example was freedom of speech. He said you cannot have freedom of speech without private presses, that if the government owns the presses, you can't really have freedom of speech. Even if legally you say you do, what freedom, you can only say what the government will let you say if the government owns the presses. So I'll show that Hayek and Jewkes said something very similar, except with freedom of occupation rather than freedom of the presses. That Hayek, of course, wrote The Road to Serfdom, and John Jewkes, about the same time, he wrote The Ordeal by Planning, which Hayek said was actually the best practical illustration of the road to serfdom. So I think these two books go together, and I want to show what they had to say about freedom of occupation and how freedom of occupation relies on freedom of labor prices. And then I'll also then say what is this, so Road to Serfdom and Ordeal by Planning were both about like hard socialism, and I'll also show how these arguments were modified by Hayek in his later works, Constitution of Liberty and Law and Legislation of Liberty concerning the welfare state. So in Road to Serfdom, Hayek said, if they want to plan, they must control the entry into the different trades and occupations. And similarly, Jewkes said, whatever the original intentions of the planners, compulsion of labor soon becomes inevitable, for how otherwise can labor be got into the appropriate jobs? And the idea is, if you want to plan an economy, and you want to decide what will be produced, by whom will it be produced, how will it be produced, logically you have to tell people where to work. You can't let people choose where they want to work and where they want to live if you're simultaneously trying to plan all production and decide who will produce what where. They're just completely logically incompatible. The same way that you can't have freedom of speech when the government owns all the printing presses, you can't have freedom of occupation if the government is trying to decide everything that will be produced, how and where. And actually, in actual history, the British Control of Engagements Order in 1947 actually lived out this prediction. It actually set very strict limits on a person's freedom of occupation in England. And Jewkes observed that the British planners, against all their best instincts, were driven to the restoration of conscription of labor in 1947. And I'm going to talk about, I think that's a very key phrase there, against all their best instincts. That this is about, there's a very logical progression to this. It was not because anyone was evil or because anyone was deliberately deciding how they could be the worst rulers. There was a strict economic logic to this. And Hayek similarly cited the Control of Engagements Order, and he said that 6 months after World War II, the same government found itself in peacetime forced to put conscription of labor back on the statute book. And Milton Friedman, in one of his forewords to The Road to Serfdom, he also cited the Control of Engagements Order. He said this law was one of the best corroborations of Hayek's thesis, that the fact that Britain actually had to conscript labor and restrict freedom of occupation in order to enforce the labor government's plans shows how important the road to serfdom was. By contrast, there's a scholar today, Andrew Farrant, who talks about the Control of Engagements Order, and he actually thinks that it was much weaker than Hayek thinks it was, and he kind of tries to explain it away and say, no, the Control of Engagements Order actually wasn't so bad, it doesn't really prove Hayek. And I'm personally on Friedman's side, but I wanted to recognize that there is an argument, Farrant does make an argument on the other side. So what's important, I think, is, as I said, Jewkes said, it's the logic of events and the demands of the plan. That this is not public choice. This is not about incentives or abuse of power. This was not because anyone was, a Stalinistic evil despot who, loved to see, or as Orwell said, imagine the human boots stamping on the human face for the rest of history. This was not the case. This was not that anyone was an Orwellian O'Brien who loved to see the jackboot on people's faces. It was simply that if you want to plan the economy, you're going to have to tell people where to work. And so Hayek said there is no better illustration of the manner in which the inherent logic of their policies drove an unwilling socialist government into the kind of coercion it disliked. And I contrast this with Richter and Hazlitt, I compare this to Richter and Hazlitt, because what Richter and Hazlitt illustrate in their novels is similarly, they have these socialist governments that are driven step by step into coercion against their wills, because they're sincerely trying to implement a true socialism that will really benefit the people and really bring prosperity, and accidentally, step by step, they're brought into all these horrible acts of coercion that they themselves dislike. So I think this is the complete opposite, for example, of Orwell's 1984, where Orwell is illustrating the kind of public choice, beware of the abuse of power, beware of what kinds of people you will install. Hayek and Jewkes are saying, even if you have the best people, even if they have the best of intentions, if you ask them to plan certain kinds of economic outcomes, they're going to have no choice but to implement certain kinds of coercion that they themselves may find quite disreputable. And some might say, well, what about market socialism? Doesn't market socialism show that you can have freedom of occupation and economic planning? And contrary to a lot of opinions, I think that market socialism, even by its own standards, cannot promise this. Because Oskar Lange, for example, who is the quintessential market socialist, he said, freedom of choice of occupation is assumed if the distribution of the social dividend is not egalitarian. That Lange said, if you distribute the social dividend completely equitably, he said, this will affect the incentives for different occupations, and then we won't be able to achieve the economic plan. So Lange said, if we want to have market socialism, we're going to have an unequal distribution of the social dividend, such as to incentivize people to work in those occupations which the government needs people to work in. So even Lange recognizes that if you're going to have a socialist regime, but you want freedom of occupation, you're going to have unequal distribution, which of course raises the question, well then why even have socialism? As Hayek mentioned in his criticism of Lange, wasn't the whole point of socialism to have an absolute equality of distribution? If Lange himself admits that socialism can only guarantee freedom of occupation if wages are unequal, then why have socialism? And so William Hutt, who was a free market economist, he actually grouped Llama and Learner together with Mises and Rothko. I think it's a very interesting grouping. I don't know if anyone else has ever grouped Mises and Rothko as agreeing with Llama and Learner. But he said they both shared a fundamental agreement that the price system has important equilibrating and coordinative functions, which he said was rejected by Keynes, because if you look at the essence of Keynes' system, is a rejection of Say's law, a rejection of the idea that prices coordinate. But Lange and Learner, market socialists they were, recognized that prices do coordinate, and that you cannot have freedom of occupation with some sort of productive outcome unless you have freedom of wages. And they recognize that wages need to be unequal, that different occupations need to make different wages than each other if you want to have the efficient allocation among different wages. Some of Lange's followers, however, were less educated. So Michael Harrington, who was a democratic socialist, said, the wage structure would be infinitely more progressive than it is within capitalism. But differentials related to skill and output would be tolerated precisely as an incentive. So I think Harrington has no idea what he's talking about. You're going to have a progressive wage structure with differentials to incentivize different skills. That makes no sense. David Schweikart, another democratic socialist, said that you would have a democratic market-conforming plan. Which, of course, well, which one? Will it be democratic or will it be market-conforming? You can't have both. So I think Mises actually referred, well, of course, Mises does not refer to Schweikart, but Mises in Socialism in 1920 managed to predict basically everything that everyone would say for the next century. So Mises already responds to plans like this and calls them a four-sided triangle. So I think it's interesting that Lange recognizes that you need to have unequal wages if you want freedom of occupation. Some of his followers, I guess, knew less economics, and even though they cited Lange, like Harrington and Schweikart actually cite Lange and say, we are going to use Lange to refute Mises. But then they turn right around and they don't understand what Lange was saying, and they think we can have equality of wages while having freedom of occupation, while having good incentives. And they have no idea about the fact that these all contradict. So that's all about like hard socialism. If the government wants to like comprehensively plan the entire economy from A to Z, you have to make a choice. Do you want freedom of occupation with inequality of wages, or do you want equality of wages with the government having to command people where to work, what to produce, and how? So the question is, well, what about the contemporary welfare state? Is this only all applicable to like hard planning and socialism, or does it have any applicability today? I think it does have applicability today, although it's weaker. I mean, the best case, the best case to make about these arguments is with hard socialism. That is the quintessential big government. And anything about the welfare state, you're going to have to weaken your argument a bit. Which I think some people make a mistake with Hayek. They take road to serfdom and they immediately try to apply it to the welfare state as if the welfare state were the Soviet Union, which of course it's not. Any arguments you make against the welfare state are going to have to be weaker and more equivocal. If libertarians think the welfare state is just as bad as the Soviet Union, they've done something wrong. But I think the arguments do apply. What I'll first say is Hayek is more famous regarding the welfare state for different arguments. So I want to acknowledge what those arguments were and say those are not the arguments I'm going to be talking about. So Hayek says that the welfare state violates the rule of law because it requires treating people unequally. That equal outcomes require unequal treatment. So he says if you wish to adhere to the rule of law, then you cannot have a comprehensive welfare state. And he says that the welfare state idea transforms society from a spontaneous order of rules that have no end state intention that you follow the rules, and whatever the outcome of the rules are, it must be just because those are the rules. And he says if you want to guarantee end state outcomes, you're going to have a unitary organization where end states are directed in advance, and it's no longer rule driven but outcome driven. And Hayek here is referring back to what he said in Road to Serfdom, that planning presumes more agreement than actually exists. That you're assuming that we can all agree on certain end goals that we all want achieved. And that if you believe in pluralism, you believe that different people have different goals and different intentions, then you can't have a comprehensive welfare state that guarantees end goals. But the argument here I want to make is Hayek actually says something else in Constitution of Liberty and Law, Legislation, Liberty that goes back to the argument about freedom of occupation and wages. That he thought that distributive justice and equality would lead to price controls on labor. And so he said distributive justice is irreconcilable with freedom in the choice of one's activities. Because he thought that in order to achieve equality in the welfare state, he thought we would start setting price controls on labor, which would lead us right back to the problem that he argued in Road to Serfdom, that if you want to plan economic outcomes, you'll have to tell people where to work. So this is in contrast with the public choice arguments, again, that Tulloch, for example, refers to the recipient of charity as a rent seeker. That he says, if a person receives charity, they're going to change their lifestyle in order to receive more charity. And so this is going to lead to perverse incentives. If you pay a person, even though he doesn't work, he'll have no incentive to work. And similarly, James G. Cannon refers to the Samaritan's dilemma, that if the good Samaritan gives money to the poor, he poses the problem that he's going to create poor incentives and that the poor person won't want to work. This is not the argument that Hayek is making. Those are arguments about incentives, that charity perverts incentives. Hayek is saying not only does it pervert the incentives, but prices also communicate knowledge, and that this knowledge is necessary for freedom of occupation. He says if remuneration does not correspond to the value of a person's efforts, they will have no basis for deciding whether the pursuit of a given object is worth the effort and risk. He would necessarily have to be told what to do. And what Hayek is saying is, even if a person wants to work, even if he wants to be socially productive and do the best thing he can, if all wages are equal, he'll have no idea what the most productive labor is. He won't even know where he ought to work in order to be socially productive, unless wages are unequal and communicate relative scarcity. And similarly, Hayek said, once the rewards an individual can expect are no longer the appropriate indication of how to direct their efforts to where they are most needed, then prices lose their guiding function that they have in the market and would have to be replaced by the commands of the directing authority. So once again, Hayek is not arguing about incentives. He's not saying that if you give a person charity, they will no longer have the incentive to work, which is an important argument. That's more the public choice argument about incentives. He's saying they won't even know where to work. And the individual can be left to choose the direction of his efforts only if rewards fluctuate with the value of the services he can contribute. If his income is politically determined, he loses not merely the incentive, but also the possibility of deciding what he ought to do in the general interest. So again, here's the Austrian economic calculation knowledge problem. He won't even know what is socially productive if prices are all made equal. And so if prices are made equal and you want people to be socially productive, you'll have to direct them where to work. You won't be able to let them choose themselves where to work because people won't even know where to work. And so if he cannot know what he must do to make his services valuable to his fellows, he must be commanded to do what is required. I think, let me skip some of these quotes. So this is related to what Hayek called Mill's muddle, which is referring to John Stuart Mill, which was the belief that production and distribution could be disconnected. That Mill thought, we can redistribute wealth any way we want and it won't affect production. Hayek is saying, no, production and distribution are intimately connected. Prices communicate knowledge of relative scarcity, that they communicate both information and incentive. So not only do you need the incentive to work, but you need to know what work needs to be done. And so you can, if you alter distribution, if you make wages equal, people will lose not only the incentive, but also the knowledge. And I'll say that the welfare state, I think, has not led to this kind of totalitarian command here that Hayek thought it would, because the welfare state has not attempted to maintain production while altering distribution. We don't see welfare states tending to try to ensure that a given productive output is maintained amidst all the redistribution of wealth. We tend to see wealth redistributed and then just let the market take things where they will, let the market adjust, and production will adjust itself to the altered distribution. But you don't see an attempt to ensure that production is the way that it would have been without the distribution. So Farrant and McPhail point to this fact that the welfare state is not totalitarian, and they say, well, then therefore Hayek is wrong. All of his arguments were just wrong, and we can ignore him. And I think that's premature. I think what it means is that while Hayek incorrectly predicted the course of future policy, while we don't see the kinds of price controls on labor that he thought we would have, it does not invalidate his criticism of that policy. That had that policy been followed, the consequences would have been what Hayek predicted. If we did try to ensure that production maintained a certain pattern amidst all the redistribution of wealth, then we would have the totalitarian consequences that Hayek predicted. We would have corvée of labor and compulsory allocation of labor if we tried to have egalitarianism with productivity. But since generally welfare states have redistributed wealth without trying to ensure any kind of productivity, we haven't had to have the forcible reallocation of labor. But even though policy has not been what Hayek thought it would be, the criticism is still valid, and maybe we've avoided the totalitarianism precisely because Hayek warned against it. Maybe it's precisely because Hayek wrote about the dangers of price controls on labor. Maybe that's how we avoided it. Well, maybe the control of engagements order, of 1947, it was actually repealed soon after. Maybe one reason why it was repealed was because people actually learned this actually doesn't work. We can't have this in the kind of society we want to have. I do think it has some implications for some other theories, though. Ronald Dworkin, for example, believes that people deserve compensation for their labor, but not for their talents. That a person is morally deserving of the labor they put into an effort, but if insofar as their productivity is owed to certain talents that they were born with undeservedly, he says they don't deserve compensation for that. So if you work twice as hard, you deserve twice as much pay. But if you're born stronger and taller and smarter, you don't deserve extra pay for that. You don't deserve that. And nice as that may sound morally to some, there's an economic problem with that. And Hayek, I think, would say, well, talent is a scarce resource. We need not only to incentivize, but also to inform. People need to know where their talents are needed. And he says, labor prices act as signals to change the direction of their efforts. Their function is not so much to reward people for what they have done, as to tell them what in their own and as well in the general interest they ought to do. So Hayek is basically, I think, saying almost to Dworkin, let's say you're right. Let's say people really don't deserve to be compensated for their talents. Even if they don't deserve to be compensated for their talents, they still need to be compensated for their talents anyway in order to inform them where to use their talents. We're not trying to reward them. We're not trying to give people what they deserve. No one deserves any kind of payment. I think you would say in a free market, you deserve whatever payment your employer wants to give you. No one has any claim to any kind of compensation, but we have to pay them enough to inform them where their efforts are needed. That if you want people to work in the place where they're most productive, you can't guarantee them an equal income. Because even if the person wants to be socially productive, even if he says, I'm receiving charity, but I'll work anyway, I'll get a job anyway, just so that I'm being productive. We'll get a job doing what? You don't even know what job to do unless you pay people unequally for different kinds of labor. I'm not sure how this might apply to Rawls, because Rawls's difference principle is interesting. He doesn't think that anyone deserves anything in particular, but so whereas Dworkin is very much talking about what people deserve, Rawls says no one really deserves anything, but we need to distribute wealth in such a way that will maximize the welfare of the least well-off. And I think there, though, that runs back into a knowledge calculation problem, because we have to know, well, what will maximize welfare? What distribution will maximize the welfare of the least well-off? And that comes not only to incentives, but also knowledge. We need to know what wage structure will induce people to work in the most productive occupations they can. So I think Rawls kind of ends up with a great amount of indeterminacy. I think it's probably impossible to figure out what wage structure would lead to Rawls's outcome of maximum welfare for the least well-off, because I think the calculational problems are just too immense, and it's impossible for human cognition to know what kind of price or wage structure would satisfy Rawls. So I think in conclusion, we cannot arbitrarily promote equality because of Mill's model, because production and distribution are related. Any kind of wage structure, any price system will not only alter incentives, but also information. People need to know which occupations are needed. So, you know, if you're trying to decide whether to be a doctor or whether to be an electrical engineer, let's say a person is smart enough to be both. Well, which one is needed more, doctors or electrical engineers? We need unequal wages, so that supply and demand will communicate how labor needs to be redistributed. So you'll see a shortage over here and a surplus over there. But if we force all wages to equality, people will have no idea what they ought to do, even if they have the greatest willingness to do it. So this is, again, very much the Austrian problem of economic calculation, not the public choice incentive problem. And I'll say I'm still thinking about how to frame this. You know, I talked about Rawls and Dworkin at the end. I'm a little bit unsure exactly if those are the best ways to frame this for contemporary relevance. I'll also say the written paper doesn't quite emphasize the public choice versus Austrian that I'd like to. I emphasize it a little bit more in the lecture. I want to go back in the paper and emphasize that distinction a bit more, because I think it's important. If you look at how, you know, Mises and Hayek were saying about socialism, they were saying, you know, assume the most perfect, altruistic, unself-interested government, the socialist government still wouldn't know what to do. And that's completely opposite of a public choice argument, which is, well, look, these are human beings. What do you think they're going to do when you put them in power? They're going to abuse power as humans do. Those are both very important arguments, but they're both completely different arguments that I think should be kept separate. Because I think a lot of people know that wages lead to an incentive. They know that if you give a person charity, they'll have less incentive to work. But I think they're less aware that even if a person wants to work, they won't know what work to do anymore. And,
Now the comment is given by Professor Victoria Curzon-Price, who is Professor of Economics in Geneva, and she's a member of Perverse Institute in Switzerland.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is this working? Do I want the? It's not working, is it? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Makovi, for an excellent paper. It's always pleasant to sort of go back and reflect on just to read the classics, our classics, and also to reflect on their relevance to today's problems, because that's our task, really, is to bring everything up to date and try to see what we can do to propose practical things. And this is where I think the paper is very useful, because we start in the 1940s with Road to Serfdom and hard socialism and complete state planning. And this was what Hayek was fighting when he wrote The Road to Serfdom. And then has been criticized later because it didn't happen. And as the author says, this is not doesn't disprove the basic proposition that if you have central planning, you're going to lose freedom, of course. But it does raise the issue of how we move along the continuum towards serfdom or towards freedom. This is why I asked for the board there, because I like to sort of draw pictures while I'm talking. And if I can ask the person with the microphone, I will be able to switch there. and show, just in pictures how I see this problem of bringing the Hayekian message up to date, so to speak, and to apply it to the modern world, as you're doing. Perhaps I'll just. Yeah, no problem. Thank you very much. And I can still see what I'm up to. So, there we go. This is not really like a seminar room, isn't it? But we can improvise, which is very nice. Okay, I've been wondering which direction to draw the road to serfdom. I sort of did it as a continuum, but since reading the previous paper on how Rothbard says, it's quite obvious. I'm not being a value judgment when I say that prosperity and freedom are better than slavery. So I'm going to draw it in this way, a negative, right? So here's serfdom, and that's freedom. Okay. Is this a deterministic road? This goes back to some of the historicism we were talking about earlier. And of course, it's only deterministic in the theoretical way. If you go absolute planning, then you get to serfdom. But what we have in current systems is the mixed economy. And so you have egalitarianism here. Just call it E, that aims towards egalitarianism. Here you have economic efficiency, I've just called productivity here, and freedom. Freedom is this is the sort of magic triangle which our socialists and the good-hearted people would like us to be able to have both equality, efficiency, and freedom all at the same time. And what Makovi has just said is that, of course, this is impossible, and we know that it's a dream that it's impossible. And we are situated somewhere here with the modern soft welfare state, with quite a bit of egalitarianism locked into the system through progressive taxation and redistribution. We've lost a lot of economic efficiency as a result, and quite a bit of freedom in the process. And so we're stuck somehow in this road. And what I find interesting is that, of course, we could go either way. There's no deterministic in this at all. We've seen the welfare state take a huge leap during the current financial crisis. The current levels of indebtedness, the level of the saving, it's very worrying. We've taken a sort of an extra step down this direction, for sure. Okay, so we're losing freedom, we're getting further and further away from these objectives here. Now what's interesting, if you go in this direction, you get both together, so there's a kind of convergence here. These two are actually really linked. So that I just separated them out so that you could see what was happening. So, mainly getting in this direction. Now, you are aware at the moment of the big debate on the sort of fourth industrial revolution, no jobs for anybody coming along, robots are going to do everything, no jobs. And so we have this universal, unconditional state benefit is the socialist answer. I would like just to, I would first of all like to start with a very, very simple supply and demand diagram of a labor market for the victims of globalization, unskilled labor, right? So we'll start up here with supply, demand, and the market clearing wage for labor, which is deemed quite unacceptable. This is the in-working poor, they're not working, they're not earning enough, they're not earning a living wage. So we have a politically determined living wage. Okay. We all know that this results in unemployment. That's very simple economics, no problem, we're not going to do anything. This is why we have 10% unemployment in the European Union. basically average and it's politically determined. And these people are just kept out of the market, and you have the welfare losses that we know about. And that's not going to keep me worried much further, except that now I'm going to stretch out here the available jobs. Exactly the information problem that you were referring to, sir. That there are a lot of jobs in the market. I'll start from here and they go whoops like that, and we know out here you get some very, very well-paid jobs, and we would all like to be there. So let's call this in here, and this is the jobs available. Now we have market clearing wages for each one of these jobs. Obviously, there are different markets here, right? So there's a very low market clearing wage for this kind of job, and then a higher one slightly. There's a lot of low-paid wage labor here. And then they get slightly more productive jobs here. This is not the politically delicate part of the graph, right? Until you get here, then you get people earning millions and millions. But most of our economy is somewhere here. It's here that's my problem this morning. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to take my basic living wage, let's call it that, and there it is. At this point, if I have a universal, unconditional benefit at this level, whatever it is, then all these jobs are picked up. These are just not done because people will prefer to take the universal benefit. And why should they work? There's no information. These jobs just don't get available. They're just not there. And this is unemployment. And has to be paid for out of taxation, out of progressive taxation. This is a problem in the sense that it's drawn on a static graph, but we all know that there's a hidden dynamic here, that there will be a big army of unemployed people, and that there will be pressure to raise that minimum up and up and up. That will be part of the political game, but we will be losing a lot of information output. And the firms, the entrepreneurs will not have access to a whole lot of labor, which they might need in operating their business. After all, businesses need a whole range of people, from the cleaning lady to the gentleman to the electrician and computer specialist. So you need all sorts of people in a business. But they won't be there, they will be out somewhere else. Now, in the whole debate of the universal benefit, unconditional benefit, very few people have, well, perhaps they have, but you have Milton Friedman with his negative income tax, who long ago said, well, if you really do have a political problem with low-skilled people in a job market, and you want to do something about them, and just introduce a negative income tax. And so on this graph, I can show you what Milton Friedman's system would be like. What he says is this guy or gal working here earns this, and we top up to the minimum, what is it? The living wage, living wage. We top it up to there. This one's working here, we top up, we top up, we top up, we top up to the point here. Well, there are many differences between the Milton Friedman negative income tax and the universal, unconditional benefit, we'll leave it at UUB. So the universal benefit has to find the tax money for the whole rectangle here, the Milton Friedman's negative income tax just needs the shaded area. But much more importantly, on the other side of the equation, you have all the business firms that can in fact engage all this labor at market wages. This is the market clearing wage for each type of labor. The information is not lost. And you have a whole range of supply of labor into the marketplace. Just imagine that our firms able to employ people at market rates. Well, by definition, they can be efficient. That information gets out into the economy, and firms once more can breathe, can get the labor they need. Now, a little extra would be to have another line which would be the minimum personal tax allowance, and let the tax kick in a little bit later than the so-called living wage. And then you would avoid quite a bit of the poverty trap problem. The people who have in this bit of the wage section, they would say, "Ah, great, I did an extra good job, and I still won't be in the tax debt. I'll still be able to my taxes only kick in at this point." I mean, you have to iron out the poverty trap problems in all these interventions. I'm just trying to convey the difference between the universal unconditional benefit and the Milton Friedman negative tax. It seems to me that the important thing to distinguish is that in the first one, in the universal whatever benefit, you have a huge army of unemployed people. And in the Milton Friedman negative, you have no unemployment. There's zero unemployment. Well, that's in theory, of course, but people are moving between different jobs. And then again, if we add in the dynamics, think of these people learning, improving. They're not going to stay in these jobs forever. They're moving on, they're moving up. They're going into the real world and getting on with their lives. And there's a big difference. And then I come back to my previous thing, is that here we are in this welfare state quandary. And many of my liberty-loving friends say, "Oh, we can't endorse any form of government intervention because that would be contrary to our philosophy." But I think we must, if we know that we're in a messy real world and we want to move a bit more towards in this direction, we have to accept some government intervention in some places. I think Milton Friedman negative income tax is not a bad idea, given the present pressures to push us towards equality, the present fears of increasing unemployment in the years to come because of, I don't know, robotics or whatever's coming in, the continuing problem of dealing with factor price equalization due to trade with China, all these things coming in all the time. I think it's we have to find a solution to the angst, the anxiety, the angoisse coming into the political system through loss of jobs, loss of and growing unemployment. I would recommend going back to Milton Friedman's negative income tax as a small contribution to keep us going in this direction, in the messy, non-theoretical, practical world of politics. Thank you very much.
You have to reply, I guess, and sing.
And of course, I didn't say enough about how good the paper was.
Thank you. Vicky, your point is Friedman, but in a way, is also Hayek's point. But that kind of implied substituting a whole bunch of different welfare measures and a whole bunch of different kind of interventionism that basically made the price system not working as it should. It seems to me that unfortunately those that are advocating today a minimal universal income are not thinking about moving out of old-style interventionism to have, you know, a kind of a distribution that could be in principle compatible with the working of the price system. What they want to do is supplementing the old welfare state with these. And I don't know if you happen to have read the speech of Mrs. May at the Conservative Convention, and she said very clearly she wanted to be as far from the socialist left as she is from the libertarian right. And she wants the government making the market work for its own goals. So it seems to me we are getting into an age in which people would love to have universal minimum income, so this way, if robots take our jobs, we're fine. But at the very same time, they want to have industrial policy, labor subsidies, of course, and price controls back in.
Yeah. Well, of course, you're right. I didn't want to go into that second. But of course, these proposals, the universal unconditional benefit, is supposed to replace all the other stuff. Well, fine. But then, then the Milton Friedman's negative income tax could do just the same, but much better.
I appreciate that argument because, yeah, I do think there is some utopianism in a lot of schemes to replace the welfare state. That, we assume that we'll replace one regulation with another, and it seems like oftentimes the political dynamic is more, let's keep what we already have and just add more stuff on top of it. That it seems like the political dynamic is always more and more, never much less of anything. So I think, I think that's a kind of public choice. I think understanding of how the political process actually works. So I'm not exactly sure if that means we shouldn't even try, or if it just means we should be very skeptical. But certainly we should at least be very skeptical. Certainly if we have a scheme of let's replace this with that, we should at least be aware of the possibility that we'll end up adding on without taking anything away. I'm just not sure, practically speaking, what that means we ought to do.
No question?
Thank you, Michael, for a very interesting paper, and also thank you, Victoria, for the comments, which actually prompted me to have actually two questions. First, well, actually comments perhaps more. First on this question of negative income tax and guaranteed minimum income. I mean, well, of course, Hayek himself was in favor of some form of this in basically all of his writings. Just a question, or actually a comment to Victoria. I mean, I think it's always hard to know exactly what model you were referring to here with your comparison between the NIT model and the guaranteed state benefit that you're talking about. I mean, the most forms of the guaranteed minimum income that I've heard discussed, and I'm involved in the research, actually they are equivalent technically with the negative income tax as far as incentives are concerned. So that's a kind of a technical issue that would require a lot of opening up, but like it doesn't matter from the point of view of the people or of the state, or the incentives that are created, whether it's done through the tax system or whether it's done through a combination of benefits and reforms on the tax side at the same time, because the sort of incentives and effect on unemployment actually remain the same. But that's a sort of technical question that we discuss in detail. But my second comment is to Michael, and it is that in Hayek, I think there's kind of conflict or tension between actually what Victoria drew here between sort of productivist side and the freedom side, because Hayek obviously sees a relation there and sees that freedom and productivity are intimately linked. But at the same time, there's a sort of conflict there because he emphasizes the incentivizing effect of the market and kind of the disciplining effect of it as well. So when we're talking about the disciplining effect of the market, we're also kind of talking about a system that directs people, right? So then we have to talk about soft power versus hard power, right? So because after all, if the market is disciplining, then it does create incentives, especially direct people into certain occupations. So that might effectively limit kind of absolute freedom in some ideal sense, because after all, people can't just choose to spend the time doing what they really want to do, perhaps, but they are driven to certain occupations, right? So that sort of perhaps is a kind of a conflict between like freedom in some ideal sense and freedom in the sense of disciplining markets.
Thank you. So I guess part of your question would have to be answered by a philosopher, and some of that is philosophy above my pay grade. You know, there was an interesting incident recently where economics professor, first he asked a philosopher, what's the proper amount of murder in the world? And the person said, well, 0. And then he turned to me and said, Michael, what's the proper amount of murder in the world? I said, well, as much murder as we can stop at, the proper cost, because any murder that would cost more, to stop it than the efficient rate of murder, we could stop all the murder in the world if we had, 10 cops for every non-cop. But obviously that, probably would be more costly. So I can take the economic side, not the philosophical side. The philosophers want to talk about, what's just, that's fine for them. I'll talk about what, we can actually achieve with constraints. So does the market, force people into occupations, and is that another form of power? And I guess I would say, I suppose, but I guess that's how scarcity works. We live in a world of scarcity. We can't have everything we want. One way or another, people have to be allocated into different occupations. Either the government has to tell you where to work, or prices have to tell you where to work. And not everyone can be a gardener. Some people have to be a garbage man, and that's just the world we live in. And you might say, well, isn't it unfair that some people get to be gardeners and other people have to be garbage men? And I don't know, is that fair or unfair? I don't know. That's just how the universe works, that we need some people to do the jobs that nobody wants to do. And as an economist, I just say we want to figure out the best way of figuring out who ought to do the things that nobody wants to do. And whatever that way is, in the end, someone's going to have to do the things that nobody wants to do. And I feel like it's kind of pointless to talk about how unfair that is. Because
Can I just react to the difference with the universal unconditional benefit? Is just a check through the post, or whether that's an old-fashioned way of doing it. So it's just a credit to your account every month. It's unconditional, that's the whole point. So you don't have to work. Whereas the freedom thing is you do have to work. You are in a job. You have to, in order to get the benefit, you get the job. You have to first get the job.
No, actually, I think in the freedom model, if you don't work, you still get benefits.
Well, then I should improve on the freedom model. It seems to me quite obvious that you have to work in order to get the negative income tax.
And the state has to tell people,
No, just have the jobs out there.
No,
You get nothing unless you already work.
Maybe following up on the last question, when I was reading your paper, Michael, I was puzzled by who do you actually talk to? Who is your target audience? Which conversation do you want to join in? And that poses the question of the framing of the paper. Because as I understood now your presentation, you're talking also a bit about working and roles, and so there could be, I think, an interesting case to join the contemporary like egalitarians who talk about this and who are concerned about freedom of occupation, and who actually discuss in all these hard soft power relations. So there you could jump in. For an economist, it sounds like there's not so much novelty. So I found that the earlier route much more promising, but then in the comments you kind of rejected to join the egalitarian debate. So I was much more puzzled by all of that. So who is the dialogue you want to engage in academically?
So yeah, that's a little bit of what I'm figuring out. That I was like as I was already finishing the paper, I started to think, who is my audience, and I started wondering, maybe the luck egalitarianism offers me, a good audience. But I sort of put that in the paper at the end because I'm still, I guess part of what I'd like, was hoping to hear from the audience is, how is my framing working? I started to realize, this paper kind of grew out of what I'd been doing with George Orwell, and I sort of wondered where exactly does this paper fit. So, I'd like to, if you have anything to add on, I can't answer that question. That's what I'm trying to figure out. So if you have anything else, or if anyone else has anything to add on that question, that's one thing I'm hoping to learn here.
I think like egalitarianism is a promising field, but then you would have to give up the badging of philosophy.
Congratulations for the paper.
Economic theory shows us that control prices creates shortage. Then some economic theorists of planning said that taxes, shortage, are consistently created for to raise the prices and to sell the goods in the black market. We are seeing it in Venezuela now. Control prices, raise the prices in the black market, and then government officials sell the goods in the black market at shortage at no and deliberately there. In the labor market, would be the same. You are supposing that planners are have good intentions, are good people that looks for the quality. They are looking for inequality in your benefit. For example, if you control the price of wage of labor, you create shortage in some kinds of labor, especially the kind of works that planners have, engineers, economists, etc. Then they are paid not in wage, in the black market. They are paid with benefits, better houses, alcohol, sexual favors, travels, these kinds of things. And they are paid to in power. In a normal market, the pay is in money, but the money gives not to special power. If I have a special work, like a doctor, for example, I decide of your life and your death. I am powerful. I cannot opt for another doctor, for example. An engineer, for example, in a factory, can decide to have the good or to have not the good. I have power from you. You can obtain a car, you cannot obtain a car. In a market, it's not possible. Then programming, I would like to know your opinion. Programming shortage in plain until creative. It's a strategy of power.
So, I mean, definitely, there's, I guess that's maybe the public choice side about let's look at the incentives of the powers that be and why might they want shortages and misallocations. And yes, absolutely, the shortage economy, every shortage creates empowers the politician who has to resolve that shortage, as we saw in the Soviet Union. I'm not exactly sure if that's where I want to take my paper. Just, I guess it seems like it might be too many topics to deal with in one paper, and I'm off the top of my head, I can't think of any really visible cases in the Western world where we've seen that kind of dynamic with labor. Maybe, I'm mostly familiar with the United States. Certainly, though, that could happen. I mean, certainly, theoretically, if you had a shortage of labor, it definitely would empower politicians. So absolutely, that's one more reason to oppose any kind of price control or manipulation of prices. Absolutely.
Yes.
Could I come in here? In your paper, you point out that the current welfare state governments don't attempt to introduce price or quantity controls in most markets. Of course, the big ones like education and health are big silos of Soviet planning, but this is deplorable, but it doesn't sort of leak out into the general economy of providing bread and milk and meat and clothes and that sort of stuff. So the markets remain free, although the state is taking 50% of output in form of taxation in one form or another. And they've managed to skim through without command or control of this economy. They still live off it. Imagine how efficient, in fact, that economy has to be to support the other 50%. So it's still reasonably efficient, and this is a paradox. Because you'd have thought that by now, with all the income tax and redistribution, the incentive problems and knowledge problem this has introduced, we should be collapsing. And I offer one or perhaps two possible explanations for this, but the main one is that the well of productivity and innovation continues to provide resources and change the economy dynamically, constantly. And this is magical, really. It keeps going. I would point out for our European friends, of course, most of this well of productivity and inventiveness the well is still full of ideas in the United States, where it's much less, it's flowing less abundantly in Europe. Most innovations don't occur here anymore. But they spread out, once they're there, they spread quickly across the whole world and hit even, China and everyone else. So you, thank you, you are keeping us all going. And this productivity well and its abundance, in fact, is keeping the welfare state going in Western Europe. Without it, we would have been gone long ago, through sheer inefficiency.
Thank you, Victor.
Indeed, you actually remind me of a statement by Phil Magnus that he said there are a lot of people who think that in order for capitalism to be viable, you need a social safety net to render capitalism palatable. And he says, no, I think they're reversing the causality. It's only capitalism that produces the wealth to uphold a social safety net. He says you compare Sweden to Venezuela. Sweden can afford its welfare state. Venezuela cannot. So it's not that, it's not that like because Sweden has a welfare state, therefore people, will accept Swedish, relative capitalism. Well, no, Venezuela also tried, a safety net, and it hasn't helped their capitalism. It's the other way around. You first pay the capitalism and the productivity, then you can afford a welfare state. And I think what this also does, if you're going to have some kind of welfare state, which I am not advocating, but if you're going to have one, there are definitely better and worse kinds. So I think, for example, if you compare Sweden to Britain in around the time that Hayek was writing, let's say, people often point to Sweden. They'll say, well, look, Sweden, socialism works. Well, if you compare it to 1950s Labour England, 1950s Labour England is nationalizing things and engaging in like a sort of almost Soviet Union kind of planning. Whereas I think in relative terms, Sweden was redistributing wealth without regulating things as much. Like if you look at the economic freedom of the World Index, it's like Sweden ranks high on taxation but low on regulation. It's like, well, if you're going to have a welfare state, that's probably better to have low regulation with high taxation than, let's say, low taxation with high command and control regulation. So there are definitely better and worse ways, and definitely if you're going to have some kind of welfare state, which again I do not advocate, but if you're going to have one, you definitely want the one that will impair productivity the least, so that you can actually afford the welfare state that you're trying to create.
Well, we have to stop now. We really are happy to have this paper, and many thanks to Michael and Victoria.